Good evening, you're watching AWANI Tonight with me, Farhana Sheh. Civil authorities are investigating complaints of delays and other flight issues during the festive season. And what comes after Sri Lanka's PM Rajapaksa resigns? More on that coming up. The Transport Ministry has instructed airlines to immediately rectify issues experienced by passengers. The past week saw numerous airline passengers took to social media, complaining about delays and rescheduling of flights, as well as technical issues such as air conditioning not functioning. Minister Datuk Sri Wee Ka Siong said its ministry, the Civil Aviation Authority and the Malaysian Aviation Commission have received and investigated passengers' reports on their experience. He said much of the complaints could be attributed to higher than usual passenger traffic during the festive season, with the airlines having to fully utilise their aircraft fleet to meet demand. The authorities, he added, have reprimanded parties involved to ensure strict compliance to technical, economic and safety regulations and will not hesitate to take action against operators that fail to do so. We also urge airlines to improve communication strategies with passengers. The Malaysian Aviation Commission, MAVCOM, is investigating complaints about airlines making indiscriminate changes to flight schedules without adequate notice provided to consumers. In a statement, the Commission said it had directed the airlines to submit all relevant data regarding flight schedule disruptions over the festive period from April 28 to May 9. These include the actual scheduled flights versus the total number of rescheduled flights by all airlines during the period. Executive Chairman Saripudin Kasim also urged customers who had faced delays or flight issues to lodge a formal complaint with the airline and to also forward their complaints to the Commission. Following the Malaysian Aviation Consumer Protection Code, for delays of up to 2 hours or more, the airline must provide care including meals, telephone calls and internet access. For delays of 5 hours or more, the airline should provide accommodation and transport if a stay becomes necessary. Auditor KPMG was intimidated into signing off the long-delayed 2013 financial statements of 1MDB by Datuk Sri Najib Razak. This is according to the audit firm's managing partner, Datuk Johan Idris, who was testifying as the 14th prosecution witness in the 1MDB tenor trial. Johan referred to a meeting on the night of December 15, 2013 with Najib over the $2.3 billion in investments made through Brazen Sky Limited in an unknown fund called Bridge Global SPC. He said the meeting was held with Najib, who was then Finance Minister. 1MDB was a wholly owned subsidiary of MOF Incorporated. It was previously reported that KPMG auditors had refused to sign off on the financial report as they had failed to get proper information on 1MDB's investment in Brazen Sky, a company incorporated in the Virgin Islands by fugitive financier Joe Low. Following its refusal to sign off on the accounts, KPMG was subsequently replaced by Deloitte. Malaysia continues its domination in diving at the 2022 Hanoi Sea Games. Duo Hanis Nazirul Jayasuriya and Gelson Javelin claimed Malaysia's 6th gold medal after winning the men's 10-meter platform synchro final, while Ng Yan Yi had brought home the 5th gold after winning the 3-meter springboard final. It was Yan Yi's 2nd goal after winning the 3-meter synchro final with Ong Ke Ying on Monday. Ke Ying also added a 2nd silver to the medal tally, finishing behind Yan Yi in the women's individual 3-meter springboard event. Malaysia is targeting to make a clean sweep of the 8 diving gold medals in this edition of the SEA Games. We'll continue after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Sri Lanka deployed thousands of troops and police to enforce a curfew after 8 people were killed in the worst violence in weeks of protests. Nearly 200 people were also wounded as Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned, but that did little to calm public anger. His resignation paves the way for dissolution of cabinet that would enable his younger brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa form a national unity government. The opposition, however, is calling for Mahinda's arrest for inciting violence against anti-government protesters. Mahinda's resignation came hours after his party's supporters stormed a protest site in the capital Colombo, attacking anti-government demonstrators. Police fired tear gas and water cannon to break up the confrontation, the first major clash between pro- and anti-government supporters since the protests began in late March. Angry protesters are now targeting ruling party coalitions. Mahinda had to be rescued by the military at pre-dawn after thousands of protesters stormed his official residence in Colombo. Outside Colombo, lawmaker Amarakirti Athukurola shot and killed a protester after being surrounded by a mob of anti-government demonstrators. He later took his own life. Another ruling party politician who was not named opened fire on protesters, killing 2 people in the south. Sri Lanka is facing its worst economic crisis following mismanagement of government finances that led to shortages of food and fuel. The resignation of Mahinda Rajapaksa, Sri Lanka's Prime Minister, may just be the beginning of the end of the dominance of Rajapaksas in Sri Lanka. However, the country's financial and political crisis are far from over. Dr. Owen Sun from the Pacific Research Centre discusses what's next for Sri Lanka.
We are not sure yet whether it is only one Rajapaksa or both Rajapaksa brothers resigning, because I think the popular demand is for both of them to resign. But I think it is unclear also whether who will be willing to take over the Sri Lankan government. I think, for example, it was offered to the opposition a few weeks ago to form the next government and so on, and they perhaps wisely, but at least politely, declined to do so, because no matter whoever is in charge at the moment, I think they will be blamed for the economic situation, the worsening economic situation.
Isan suggests for expatriates to help rebuild Sri Lanka's economy.
Sri Lanka is a country where there are a lot of expatriates who are quite well accomplished, but in some other countries, even in the United States and so on. So I think it is time for some of these expats, for example, who are very well off in other countries, for them to come back to Sri Lanka to invest and perhaps even to take charge of Sri Lanka for the moment, to tide Sri Lanka over this difficult period before, for example, all these elections and various other means of re-electing the new leaders could resume.
More importantly, Isan said countries should focus on having sound economic policies to not fall into further debt.
The government would have really need to have a very deliberate and well thought of policies in terms of economic developments. For example, balancing between the needs for domestic consumptions versus the need for foreign exports in order to earn us those hard-earned foreign currencies, and of course not to rack up a lot of foreign debts. I mean, it is understandable, for example, during a crisis such as the recent pandemic, that we borrow a bit more from foreign sources, but not to the extent of, let's say, Sri Lanka, in which their foreign debts actually exceeds the size of their GDP. That would be something that is very detrimental to the country.
Meanwhile, in Philippines, unofficial vote count shows Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has won the Philippines presidential election by a landslide. The first win by a majority since a 1986 revolution that toppled his late father's dictatorship. The senator garnered nearly 56% of the vote, compared to 28% for rival Leni Robredo. His win marks the Marcos family's return to power after 36 years. The 64-year-old is not a newcomer to politics, having served in various elected positions over the years. In the run-up to this election, his critics say he launched extensive online misinformation campaigns about his family's history and avoided debates and other areas where he might face independent questioning. Marcos Jr. will take over from Rodrigo Duterte, a popular strongman-style leader known for his brutal crackdown on drug dealers and users. His daughter, Sara Duterte, ran for vice president alongside Marcos Jr. The election was not just for the presidential positions, but also for senators, the lower house, and regional officials across the entire Philippines. The official count of all votes may take days. Marcos Jr. will also need to address the human rights situation in the country and declare an end to the anti-drug crackdown. Human Rights Watch say the next president will also likely face demands to prosecute Duterte for thousands of killings during his anti-drug crackdown deaths, already under investigation by the International Criminal Court.
Once in office, presumptive President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. should take immediate and decisive action to improve the human rights situation in the Philippines. He should declare an end to the so-called war on drugs that has resulted in extrajudicial killing of thousands of Filipinos, and order the impartial investigation and appropriate prosecution of officials responsible for these unlawful killings.
United States President Joe Biden said he is worried that Russian President Vladimir Putin does not have a way out of the Ukraine war. Putin, he added, had mistakenly believed the invasion of Ukraine would break up NATO and break up the European Union. Instead, the US and many European countries have rallied to Ukraine's side.
Speaking in Washington, Biden described Putin as a very calculating man, but without an exit strategy. He admits he is still trying to figure out what to do about that. Biden's comments came as Russian forces fired missiles at the port city of Odessa. Ukrainian authorities said one person was killed and 5 injured when a shopping center and a depot were hit. President Volodymyr Zelensky warns Russia's blockade of his country's Black Sea ports threatens global food supplies. Before the war, Ukraine exported 4.5 million tons of agricultural produce per month through its ports, 12% of the world's wheat, 15% of its corn, and 50% of sunflower oil. But the invasion has crippled its export capacity, with Russia destroying transportation infrastructure and blockading Odessa, the main port for grain exports.
Over in South Korea, new President Yoon Suk-yeol begins his new job, facing 2 major challenges as he takes office. On one hand, inflation that is threatening its economic recovery, and a belligerent North Korea testing new weapons. He said South Korea is prepared to work with the international community to present a plan that will help strengthen North Korea's economy if it is committed to denuclearization.
In his inaugural speech, Yoon signaled a tougher line on North Korea, warning of a preemptive strike if there is a sign of its imminent attack. But his speech was in highlighting more on his willingness to reopen talks with Pyongyang should the country denuclearizes. In recent months, North Korea has test-launched a spate of nuclear-capable missiles that could target South Korea, Japan, and the United States. Yoon won the presidential election in March and was sworn in earlier Tuesday at a ceremony in Seoul.
Will this week's US-ASEAN Special Summit with Joe Biden address the post-coup violence in Myanmar? Tonight on Consider This, we ask our guests why, after a year, ASEAN's 5-point consensus plan has still failed to make significant inroads to address the crisis. That's coming up right after AWANI Tonight. That is all we have for you on AWANI Tonight. I'm Vanashe. Thank you for watching.